I was 65 years old the day I learned my husband had been keeping an entire life from me. And the strangest part was that this hidden life was made entirely of me. If you had walked into my living room that afternoon, you would have seen an ordinary widow in an ordinary house, a woman in a faded cardigan, a half-finished cup of tea on the table, the low hum of the refrigerator in the background. But inside my chest, it felt like the floorboards of my world were shifting. When Arthur Langley, our family lawyer, placed a cold set of keys into my hand and said softly, "Evelyn, the beach house is yours now," I had no idea that nothing about my life would ever feel ordinary again. I stared at the keys, their weight, oddly heavy against my palm, as if they carried the gravity of 4 decades I hadn't understood. Martin left very specific instructions. Arthur went on folding his hands and watching me over his glasses. These were to be given to you only after his passing. His voice was gentle, matter-of-fact, and yet the words seemed to echo inside my skull. Only after. The beach house. 2 simple phrases that suddenly felt like riddles. For 40 years of marriage, that beach house in Monterey had existed more as a concept than a place in my mind, a vague property my husband drove off to check on every few months. Whenever I suggested we spend a weekend there, just the 2 of us by the sea, Martin would shake his head and look away, rubbing the back of his neck the way he did when something troubled him. "It's still under renovation, Evie," he'd murmur. "The contractor's taking forever. Maybe next year." Next year became a kind of private joke between us, except it wasn't funny. It stretched like an elastic band from our 20s to our 60s, 40 years of maybe next year 40 years of me accepting his answer, because Martin had never given me a real reason not to trust him, so I didn't. I went on packing his overnight bags and handing him travel mugs of coffee as he left at 6 a.m., to check on the place, never imagining that one day I'd be sitting across from our lawyer, a widow with thinning gray hair and hands that trembled over a set of keys to a house I'd never seen. My first instinct as I sat alone after Arthur left was practical and predictable, the way I'd always been. Sell it, I thought. I was living on a modest widow's pension now. What business did I have with a beach house in Monterey, a place I hadn't set foot in for a single night of our 43-year marriage? I imagined maintenance costs, taxes, repairs. The sensible thing would be to get rid of it as quickly as possible. That had always been my role. Sensible Evelyn, the one who clipped coupons, mended shirts, and turned off lights in empty rooms. But that night, the keys lay on the coffee table catching the lamplight, and something inside me refused to let them be just metal and obligation. Questions started to whisper in the quiet house, threading through the tick of the wall clock and the occasional passing car outside. Why had he kept me away for so long? Why only after his passing? What could possibly be so unfinished that it took 4 decades to renovate? By morning, curiosity had settled into my bones like a new kind of heat. I called the library where I worked part-time and told them I was feeling unwell. It wasn't a total lie. My heart was unsteady and my thoughts were scattered in ways I couldn't quite name. Then I took Martin's old car, the only thing of his that still smelled faintly of his aftershave, and slid the unfamiliar house keys into my purse. The drive to Monterey took 2 hours the road, unwinding through soft hills and coastal fog, the way Martin must have driven it countless times alone. I watched the landscape pass by and tried not to think about all those mornings I'd watched him leave at dawn, trusting that he was doing exactly what he said he was doing. I pressed my hand against the passenger seat once the empty space where he should have been and whispered into the silence. "What were you doing, Martin?" When I finally turned onto the narrow gravel road that, according to Arthur's directions, led to our beach house, I braced myself for something half-ruined and sad, a long abandoned shell of a place perpetually under construction. Instead, what appeared before me stole the breath straight from my lungs. The cottage at the end of the drive stood immaculate against the backdrop of the sea, A charming coastal home with fresh white paint, a pale blue door, and flower beds spilling over with carefully tended blooms. The lawn was trimmed, the windows shone in the afternoon light, and delicate wind chimes sang from the wraparound porch, their melody strangely familiar as they danced in the ocean breeze. This was not a house under renovation. This was a house being lovingly kept. My hands trembled as I climbed the porch steps, the boards beneath my feet solid and smooth. The key slid into the lock without resistance turning, as if it had been used only yesterday. When I pushed the door open, I expected the musty breath of a place long closed. Instead, the air that greeted me smelled faintly of lemon oil and lavender, an almost domestic scent that wrapped itself around my memories. A vase of flowers, real ones, not plastic, stood on the entry table. They were wilting slightly at the edges, but they had clearly been fresh only a few days ago. Someone had been here recently enough that the house still felt inhabited, as if I had just stepped out for groceries and come back. Only I had never been here in my life. My footsteps echoed softly over polished hardwood floors as I wandered into the living room. The decor stopped me short. Soft blues and whites, the exact palette I used to sigh over in magazines when I said, half jokingly and half hopeful, "If we ever have a beach house, Martin, I want it to look like this." The furniture was cozy and inviting, the throw blankets folded with the kind of care I used to give to our home when my back didn't ache. And on the mantel, arranged with loving precision, were framed photographs. I moved closer, my pulse pounding in my ears, and felt my world tilt. Every photograph was of me. There I was at 22 in my lace wedding dress, laughing with my head thrown back as someone made a joke during the reception. There I was, on a beach in a yellow sundress. I'd forgotten I ever owned the wind tugging at my hair as I squinted into the sun. There I was in a hospital bed, older, thinner, with a scarf wrapped around my head during chemotherapy, my eyes closed and my hand resting in Martin's. And there, impossibly, I was standing in front of this very cottage, my hand brushing the porch railing, looking up at it with a soft, private smile. I had no memory of that moment, no recollection of ever having been here. My fingertips brushed the glass of that frame as my mind scrambled for explanations that wouldn't come. And for the first time since Martin's funeral, I felt the cold, sharp edge of something like fear cut through my grief. What had my husband been doing here all these years, building an entire life full of my face in a place I was never allowed to see? I don't know how long I stood there in that living room staring at the photographs as if they might rearrange themselves into answers. The ocean murmured somewhere beyond the walls, steady and indifferent, while inside me everything trembled. Eventually, my legs carried me forward on instinct toward the kitchen, where another wave of shock waited. The refrigerator hummed quietly, its seal tight and clean. Inside, neatly arranged like offerings, were foods I loved and rarely bought for myself. Raspberry yogurt, the expensive kind I only splurged on for birthdays. Fresh strawberries, a carton of Earl Grey tea, even a half-eaten container of chocolate ice cream. My guilty comfort on nights when life felt too heavy. I touched the ice cream carton as if it might burn me. Someone had eaten from it recently, someone who knew my favorite flavor without asking. On the counter sat a small calendar, simple and unassuming. I flipped to the current month, my pulse quickening when I saw the date circled in red. Written in Martin's familiar handwriting were the words, "Evelyn arrives." My breath left me in one sharp, staggering exhale. How had he known? How could he possibly have predicted the very day I would first set foot here? The house was beginning to feel less like a building and more like a message, a place humming with intention. I steadied myself against the counter until the dizziness faded enough for me to move again. I needed to see everything. I needed to understand what all of this meant. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my hand brushing the smooth banister, as if I were afraid the house might vanish if I didn't touch it. The master bedroom was a warm sanctuary of soft sunlight and gentle colors. My wedding quilt. My grandmother's hand-stitched masterpiece lay spread across the bed, as if waiting for me to slip beneath it. We had stored that quilt in our attic when the fabric grew too delicate for daily use. Yet here it was preserved and unfaded, displayed like a treasured relic. On the nightstand sat a photograph of Martin and me on our honeymoon, our arms wrapped around each other, our smiles young and untouched by the years that would follow. The tenderness of it pricked my heart with longing, but it was the walk-in closet that stole my breath completely. Inside hung clothes that belonged to me, but not my current wardrobe. These were clothes from every stage of my life, garments I had lost, donated, worn, until they fell apart or thrown away decades ago. A red dress from a company holiday party in 1987, a blue sweater I thought I had donated when we moved houses, a pair of worn slippers I'd mourned when they finally disintegrated. My past hung before me like a curated museum collection, each piece perfectly preserved, each one a memory resurrected. I reached out and touched the sleeve of the red dress, its fabric smooth under my fingertips. How I whispered into the stillness, my voice trembling with disbelief. How had Martin retrieved these things? Why had he kept them? And why had he hidden them here in this house? I was never allowed to enter. My mind swirled a storm of memories and questions colliding like waves. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the steady thump of my heartbeat echo through the quiet room. I thought I knew my husband. I thought 43 years of shared mornings and late-night talks and quiet routines meant I understood him entirely. But standing in that house, surrounded by pieces of my past, I didn't even realize he'd held on to. I felt the first flicker of something profound and disorienting, the sense that Martin had loved me in ways I had never fully seen. I returned the next morning with a purposeful determination that surprised even me. I had barely slept, my dreams tangled with images of the house of photographs and clothing of Martin's looping handwriting on that calendar. I needed answers, and I sensed the house held more than I'd yet uncovered. This time, I explored more carefully, starting with a room I had assumed was a storage closet. When I opened the door, the soft click of the hinge seemed unnaturally loud. What lay beyond stole the breath straight from my lungs. The room was larger than expected, long and deep, with walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves. And on those shelves sat dozens of wrapped gifts, each one precisely labeled, each one addressed to me. I stepped inside slowly as if entering a sacred space. The first present I lifted was wrapped in paper, yellowed with age. A small card was attached for Evelyn. Christmas 1983. The necklace you admired in the shop window on 5th Street. I remembered that necklace, simple, elegant, with a sapphire pendant that had caught the winter light just so. We'd passed the store quickly. Our budget had been tight that year. I had never mentioned it again. My hand shook as I moved to the next gift for Evelyn. Your 35th birthday. The watercolor supplies you wanted when we watched that painting show. On my actual 35th birthday, Martin had apologized for not being able to afford a present. He'd cooked dinner instead, and we'd spent the evening quietly at home. I had believed him. Our finances were always tight then. But here, wrapped carefully, was the gift he'd bought for me and never given. Present after present, year after year, lay preserved in perfect condition, each one selected with tenderness, so precise it brought tears to my eyes. Some boxes were small and delicate, others large and beautifully wrapped. There were gifts for birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and even random days marked with notes like, because you looked sad that afternoon, or because you mentioned this once 10 years ago. I sank into a chair placed in the center of the room as if Martin expected I would need to sit. Surrounded by 4 decades of unspoken love, I felt as if the truth was rushing toward me faster than I could absorb it. Martin hadn't forgotten my birthdays or chosen not to give me gifts. He had simply understood me. He knew I would have refused expensive things. I had been the practical wife, the sensible one, the woman who always insisted we save our money for a rainy day. And so he had given up trying to change my mind and instead created this secret treasury of everything he wished he could have handed me over the years. It was love patient and unspent, waiting for a moment he must have believed would someday come. But the greatest shock came when I found the envelope marked our 20th anniversary. Inside were 2 plane tickets to Paris dated 20 years ago. An entire vacation planned down to the restaurants and museums, all noted in Martin's handwriting. We had never gone. That year, his mother had fallen ill and we spent our anniversary at the hospital. He'd never mentioned these tickets, never breathed a word of the plans he'd made. My throat closed around the weight of it. This was not a man indifferent to romance. This was a man who had wanted to give me the world and quietly placed it on a shelf when life got in the way. The deeper I went into that room of gifts, the more it felt as though Martin had been pouring his heart into glass bottles and tucking them onto a shelf one by one, waiting for the day I would uncork them and finally understand the depth of his devotion. Near the back, where the light from the small window softened to a warm glow, I found something different. A wooden box with a simple label that read, "The letters I never sent." My breath hitched. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each sealed, each addressed to me, each dated across the span of our marriage. I opened the most recent one first, its paper crisp and edges sharp. In Martin's familiar handwriting, he had written, "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, then you found our secret room. I know you're confused, maybe even angry. But before you judge me too harshly, I need you to understand why I did all this." His words trembled in places as if written by a hand that struggled to stay steady. I clutched the letter to my chest, sinking into the chair again as emotions surged in unpredictable waves. That one letter alone would have shaken me. But I had no idea how much more there was to unravel. Over the next 3 days, I returned to the beach house each morning at 8 a.m., sitting for hours in that gift room, reading Martin's letters one by one, until the ink blurred through my tears. Some were sweet and ordinary little stories about our days, moments he'd wanted to capture. Others were confessions of fears he'd never shared aloud. And then I reached the letter dated from 15 years ago, the one that carved a hollow into my chest so sharp it felt like a physical wound. "Evelyn," he wrote, "I saw Dr. Moreno today. The tests confirmed early onset dementia. I haven't told you because I don't want to see the fear in your eyes. I'm terrified not of dying, but of forgetting. Forgetting us." I froze the letter trembling in my hands as the room seemed to sway around me. 15 years. He had lived with that diagnosis for 15 years, hiding it from me with a grace and steadiness I couldn't comprehend. Every odd moment, every lapse I had brushed off as age or distraction, suddenly reassembled into a truth I had never imagined. The letters grew more fragmented as the years progressed. His handwriting wavered his thoughts, looping, struggling to hold shape. But one thread never wavered his love for me. He wrote of how he began building the beach house into a place of memories, a refuge where he might recognize me, even as his mind unraveled. I've started recreating rooms, he confessed, places that meant something to us. Maybe if I'm surrounded by pieces of our life, I'll hold on longer. Maybe it will help you understand someday. His words painted images of a man fighting the erosion of his mind with everything he had, building memory by memory like a fortress against the dark. The house, I realized, was his lifeline, his legacy, and his final act of devotion. I needed to see how far he had gone. Guided by the letters, I climbed the pull-down ladder to the attic, expecting dusty boxes and old furniture. Instead, I found an immaculate office, a desk filing cabinet shelves, lined with journals, dozens of them each labeled with dates. I opened the earliest one and felt my breath catch. It was a record of small things: my pancake recipe, my laugh, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear when thinking. He chronicled everything as though afraid those memories would vanish unless anchored to paper. As the years progressed, the entries grew darker, more desperate. "I forgot Buster's name today," he wrote. "I don't want to forget the sound of Evelyn's laugh. I'm writing it all down so I don't lose her." By the last journal, his handwriting was barely legible. The final entry, dated just a month before his death, read, "I didn't recognize her this morning. But when she smiled, something returned. I don't know how long I have. I need to finish the house. I need her to know I loved her even when I couldn't remember why." I closed the journal with a trembling hand. That was when I realized there was still one room in the house I hadn't seen, one locked with a different key. And according to Martin's letters, it held the most important truth of all. Finding the final key felt like chasing a ghost through memories I didn't fully understand. Martin had never been careless a day in his life, so I knew the key wasn't misplaced. It was hidden with intention. I reread passages in his journals until one small detail caught my eye, a line scribbled months before his death that read, "Important things belong in meaningful places." That simple sentence guided me back to the bedroom where the music box sat, the one that played our wedding song, with a ballerina twirling inside it. The original had broken decades ago, yet here was a perfect replica, still gleaming as though it had been polished recently. Gently, I lifted the tiny dancer from her post. Underneath, nestled into the velvet lining, was a small, ornate key, shaped like a flower. I felt a soft, aching warmth bloom in my chest. Of course he would hide it here. Of course he would choose a symbol from the beginning of us to reveal the end of his secret. My hands trembled as I made my way downstairs to the locked door at the end of the hall. The key fit perfectly, turning with the quiet finality of a truth finally being allowed to surface. When the door swung open, I stepped into a space that stole my breath more completely than anything I had seen so far. It wasn't a room, not exactly. It was a memory. It was our first apartment recreated in every perfect detail. The hideous orange carpet we used to joke about, the second-hand couch that sagged in the middle, the wobbly coffee table Martin had insisted he could fix, but never quite did. Even the old lamp from my aunt, the one with the crooked shade, stood in the corner, casting its familiar golden glow. I walked forward slowly, as though stepping into a dream. On the kitchen counter sat a cracked mug Martin had dropped and glued back together the year we were married. In a small dish beside it lay the set of keys to that apartment, the ones I had lost during our move decades ago. I touched the fridge door and remembered the sound it used to make, that rattling hum that had annoyed me in my 20s. And there, on the tiny dining table, was a note in Martin's handwriting that read, "This is where we learned how to be married." My eyes blurred as I read the rest. "Where you burn dinner every Tuesday, but I ate it anyway because you tried so hard. Where we slow danced in the living room because we couldn't afford to go out. Where I realized that loving you made being poor feel like being rich." As I crossed the threshold that should have led outside, the scene changed. I stepped into the kitchen of our second home, the one where I battled cancer. The blender from my treatment days sat ready on the counter beside a blanket, folded neatly on a chair. Another note waited. "This is where I learned what for better or worse truly meant. Where you fought for your life. Where I loved your courage even more than your beauty." The words felt like fingertips brushing old scars. I moved forward slowly through the house, and each doorway became a portal to a different chapter of our marriage. I found the Cape Cod vacation rental where we celebrated my 5-year remission, recreated with the breeze-swept curtains and seashell lamp I had loved. I found the quiet hotel room where we stayed during Martin's father's funeral, with the same heavy drapes and the same floral armchair he'd sat in while I held him as he wept. I found an almost magical recreation of Jonas Bell's Italian restaurant, the one where we'd had our first anniversary dinner. Red checkered tablecloths, flickering candles, a bottle of cheap Chianti, even the little accordion music player in the corner. On the table lay another note. You told me then that you didn't need fancy things. That spaghetti with me was better than lobster with anyone else. You made me believe that love, not money, was the true luxury. The final room was the hardest. I entered slowly, my breath already catching, because I knew what it was before I saw it fully. The hospital room where we held our daughter Sarah for the 6 hours she lived. Everything was there. The sterile smell, the monitor that beeped softly, the pink blanket they wrapped her in. On the bedside table lay a tiny hospital bracelet with Sarah Hartwell written in careful letters. My knees weakened. Beside it sat a small teddy bear I had never seen before, with a note tied around its neck. For the daughter we never got to spoil. For the grandbabies we never met. I have loved her every day, even though I only held her once. I held the bear gently to my chest, feeling as though Martin's arms were wrapped around me through the years we had lost and the ones we had lived. I didn't know how long I sat on the edge of the hospital bed, letting grief and love braid themselves together inside me. When I finally rose, I felt different. Not lighter, but fuller, as though every room had restored something I didn't realize had grown thin inside me. Back in the hallway, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It led to a small study overlooking the ocean. A journal lay open on the desk, its pages filled with Martin's final letters, the ones he wrote when he understood his time was running out. The first page began, "My dearest Evelyn, now that you've seen everything, there is one more thing I need you to know." The air in that little study felt different from the rest of the house, still reverent, still full of Martin's quiet devotion, but tinged with something else too. Something that felt like invitation rather than remembrance. The ocean spread wide beyond the window, its waves reflecting the late afternoon light in shades of silver and soft blue. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal distinct from the others, untouched by dust, as though Martin had placed it there, with the certainty that I would find it at just the right moment. I opened to the first page, and his handwriting, though shaky, carried all the strength of his voice. "My dearest Evelyn," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have walked through our memories. You have seen the rooms of our life and the love I collected piece by piece. Now I need you to understand what comes next." I traced the ink with my fingertip, my throat tightening as he went on. "You are probably wondering what I expect you to do with this house. Truthfully, I didn't build it only for me. I built it for you, for the years that come after me, for the life I hope you will still have." I turned the page, my pulse echoing in my ears, as he revealed the truth more astonishing than all the rooms, all the gifts, all the journals. There is money, Evelyn, more than you know. I invested quietly over decades in ways you didn't see because I knew you would insist we use it for something practical. But I wanted this. I wanted to create a safety net so strong that when I was gone, you could finally live the way you never let yourself live. The trust I set up for the house will cover all its expenses, and there is additional money enough to make sure you never worry about groceries, repairs, travel, or anything else that your sensible heart would try to deny. I sat back, my hand covering my mouth as the reality washed over me. All the years I had clipped coupons, patched clothes, and refused luxuries, even when Martin had wanted to spoil me. He'd been saving quietly in the background, building a future I didn't know I could have. Nearly $1 million. Investments, trust funds, accounts he had hidden because he knew I would reject them if I knew. The stunned disbelief made my shoulders tremble. But his next words erased any thought of money and replaced it with something infinitely more powerful. I know you, Evelyn. I know you would choose loneliness rather than burden anyone. I know you think the sensible thing after my death would be to downsize to live simply and quietly until the years fade. But that is not the life I want for you. I want you to live here, really live here, and I want you to fill this house with people. I blinked at the words, reading them again to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. There are women, Evelyn. Women I believe you could help and who could help you in return. He listed their names I knew well. Margaret Patterson, who lost her husband and hasn't cooked a proper meal since. Janet Murray, who hides her loneliness behind library shelves. Elena Rodriguez, who watched her husband die too suddenly to understand it. And Ruth Chen, whose children love her but live too far away to notice how small her world has become. He went on, I know it sounds strange to ask you to invite these women to live with you, but I have watched you all your life, how you create a home for others, how you listen, how you make small spaces feel warm. I believe you could build something extraordinary here. Not a boarding house, not a charity, a chosen family. I felt tears slip down my cheeks as I turned the page. You spent 43 years taking care of me, Evelyn. Let these women take care of you, too. Let them bring laughter into this house. Let them make new memories in the rooms where our old ones live. Let life continue in the spaces I built out of love for you. His final letter was the one that undid me completely. You think your life is winding down at 65, but my love, you have years ahead of you, years to grow to love, to laugh with people who understand loss the way you do. And I want you to embrace it. I want you to say yes to joy. Say yes to companionship. Say yes to the beautiful things you always denied yourself. You are not done, Evelyn, not by a long shot. And if you open your heart to the life waiting here, I promise you will find pieces of me in every sunrise over this ocean. 6 months later, I woke to the sound of laughter drifting down the hallway, bright and warm as sunlight. Margaret was in the kitchen teaching Elena how to make blueberry scones, fussing over the dough as though they'd been friends for 20 years. Janet sat on the porch beside Ruth, reading the morning news aloud while Ruth closed her eyes and listened, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. Dorothy Willis had arrived unexpectedly 2 months earlier with a single suitcase and a story that broke our hearts, and now she was in the garden humming to herself as she coaxed new roses from the soil. And I, Evelyn Hartwell, who once thought she'd spend the rest of her life alone, found myself standing in Martin's memory house, filled with a living, breathing, chosen family he had predicted long before I could imagine it. We began opening one of Martin's gifts each month, turning his long-hidden love into a shared ritual. We turned the memory rooms into spaces for conversation, laughter, honest tears. We cooked together, we watched the ocean together, and in the quiet evenings when I sat at Martin's desk, writing in my own journal, I felt his presence not as a shadow but as a blessing. The house was no longer a shrine. It had become a home again, alive in ways he had hoped for, and I had never dreamed possible. Martin had been right about many things, but most of all, this at 65, my life wasn't ending. It was unfolding. It was expanding. It was beginning in ways I couldn't have imagined before walking through that blue front door. He had given me the most extraordinary gift, not just memories, not just rooms built from love, but permission to live, to open my heart to let others in. And every day since this house has proven that even after devastating loss, new chapters can be written. Chapters filled with companionship, belonging, and unexpected joy. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Have you ever had life surprise you in a way that changed everything? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading them all, curious how far this story will travel and what pieces of it will resonate with you. And if this story touched your heart, please remember to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find it.